My parents kept my inheritance a secret and spent it on my brother's house, so I made them regret it. I always knew my parents played favorites, but I never thought they would steal from me. Let me take you back. Growing up, my younger brother, Jake, was the family's golden boy, the prodigal son, the one who could do no wrong. If I got to be on a test, I was not applying myself. If Jake barely passed with AD, oh, honey, he tried his best. School is hard for him. If I asked for new shoes because mine were falling apart, it was money doesn't grow on trees. If Jake wanted the latest $300 sneakers, boom, bought the next day. The rules never applied to him. And the worst part? He knew it. Jake took full advantage of our parents' blind devotion. He never had to work a part-time job in high school because my parents didn't want him to be stressed. Meanwhile, I was stocking shelves at a grocery store on weekends just to afford gas money. He partied all through college, blew through his allowances, and failed multiple classes. But my parents? They kept paying for everything. Meanwhile, I worked 2 jobs to pay for my own tuition because my parents told me, "You're responsible enough to handle your own education." Yeah, that was my childhood. It sucked, but I learned to live with it, until I found out they had stolen from me. The thing is, the one person who never treated me like I was second best was my grandmother. She was my safe place. She always saw me, really saw me. While my parents praised Jake for existing, my grandma was the one who actually noticed when I worked hard. Well, I got a 4.0 GPA one semester. My parents barely glanced at my report card, but my grandma, she threw me a little celebration at her house. She made my favorite meal, baked me a cake, and hugged me tight, whispering, "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart." She was the only person who made me feel important. And then, just like that, she was gone. Losing her wrecked me. I had never known grief that deep before. It was like someone had ripped a hole through my chest, and no matter how many deep breaths I took, I couldn't fill the emptiness. I remember sitting at her funeral, staring at her casket, feeling like I was in a bad dream. My parents cried, Jay cried, everyone cried, but I just felt numb. I thought about all the nights I spent at her house when I was little, how she'd tuck me in and tell me bedtime stories from her childhood, how she'd run her fingers through my hair when I was stressed, always telling me, "You're going to do amazing things one day." She believed in me more than anyone ever had. A few months later, I was starting to move forward. The grief wasn't as sharp, just a dull ache that never fully went away. And then, one night, everything changed. I had just come home from work, exhausted from a long shift, when I heard my dad talking on the phone in the kitchen. At first, I wasn't really paying attention. I was about to walk past when I heard him say something that made me freeze. "Yeah, we used the whole inheritance for the down payment. He's lucky to have us." Wait, what? I stepped back into the hallway, my heart pounding in my ears. Inheritance? My stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. I quietly pushed the kitchen door open, and there was my dad, leaning against the counter, completely oblivious to my presence. I cleared my throat. "Wait, what inheritance?" His head snapped up. For a second, he just stared at me, his face drained of color, and he gripped the phone tighter, like a guilty kid caught stealing cookies. He fumbled for words. "It wasn't that much." Bullshit. I looked at my mom, who had been standing by the sink washing dishes. She immediately avoided my eyes. That's when I knew. Something was very, very wrong. "Dad," I said, my voice eerily calm. "What inheritance?" He let out a nervous chuckle. "It's nothing, really. Just a little something your grandmother left behind." I cut him off. "How much?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Well, it wasn't really money per SC. More like an investment." I took a step closer. "What investment?" Silence. Then my mom sighed, setting the dish towel down. "Sweetheart, you don't need to get upset. We just thought." "Thought what?" My voice was sharp now. She hesitated, then glanced at my dad. He sighed, rubbing his face. "Look, we used the inheritance to help Jake buy his house, okay?" I felt like I had just been sucker punched. "What?" I whispered. Dad crossed his arms, his voice defensive. "Jake needed help with a down payment, and you don't need that money right now. So we figured." "You figured?" "That money was mine. Grandma left it for me." My mom's expression softened, like she actually expected me to understand. "Oh, sweetheart, we didn't think you'd mind. Jake needed it more than you did." She said it so casually, like it was some minor inconvenience. Like I should just accept that my future had been handed over to my brother because he needed it more. I said, "So, let me get this straight. Grandma left me an inheritance. You never told me about it. And then you spent every cent of it on Jake's house." Dad scoffed. "It's all in the family. What's the big deal?" The big deal? I wanted to scream. The big deal was that my grandmother had trusted them to do the right thing. The big deal was that I had been working myself to the bone, paying off my own student loans, while Jake was handed a house on a silver platter. The big deal was that they didn't even ask me. They didn't give me a choice. They just decided that Jake's comfort was more important than my entire future. They really thought I was just going to accept it. They had no idea what was coming. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. That night, as I sat at my desk staring at the trust documents, my anger burned deeper. This wasn't just about money. It was about how they saw me, how they had always seen me, as disposable, as less than. The moment they realized they could take from me to benefit Jake, they hadn't hesitated. They never even considered that I might fight back. And that was their biggest mistake. The next morning, I didn't go to work. Instead, I started making calls. I contacted the estate lawyer who had handled my grandmother's will. The conversation was brief, but enough to confirm what I already knew. The money had been in a trust under my name, and my parents had no legal right to access it, which meant they had stolen from me. I asked for copies of the original trust documents, and the lawyer agreed to send them over. Then I pulled up property records for Jake's house, matching the dates of the sale with the missing inheritance funds. The numbers lined up perfectly. This wasn't just favoritism anymore. This was fraud. And if they thought I was going to just roll over and let them get away with it, they had another thing coming. I waited until dinner. I could have just blindsided them with a lawsuit, but no. I wanted to see them squirm. I wanted to see the moment they realized they had lost. I sat across from them at the kitchen table, the thick folder of evidence in front of me. My mom was finishing up the dishes, humming to herself, while my dad scrolled through his phone. Jake, as usual, was sprawled out on the couch, watching TV like he had nothing to worry about. I cleared my throat. When they turned to look at me, I said it plain and simple. I knew about the inheritance. I knew they had taken it, and I was going to get it back. Silence. My mom's hand tightened around the dish towel. My dad's face flickered with something that looked like guilt, but only for a split second before he scoffed, shaking his head. He told me I was being ridiculous, that I had no right to claim anything. Then Jake spoke, and suddenly, the conversation turned from tense to downright hostile. Jake, the one who had directly benefited from my stolen inheritance, had the audacity to call me selfish. He said I was trying to ruin his life over a little bit of money. He actually had the nerve to act like I was the bad guy, like I was some villain for wanting back what was rightfully mine. I couldn't help but laugh. Jake had never worked for anything in his life, and it showed. But that's when my dad snapped. He stood up so fast the chair scraped against the floor, his face twisting in anger. He demanded to know what I was planning to do. So I told him I was going to sue them. The moment the words left my mouth, everything exploded. My mom gasped, clutching her chest like I had just stabbed her. My dad, he went ballistic. He started yelling, his voice shaking the walls, calling me every name in the book. He said I was an ungrateful brat who was trying to destroy our family over money. Jake just stood there, arms crossed, staring at me with nothing but pure entitlement. Like he couldn't even comprehend why I was doing this. The fight escalated fast. I pointed out that they had stolen from me, and my dad didn't even deny it. Instead, he doubled down. He said it was their right as my parents to make financial decisions for me. He said that the money had been better used on Jake, that I had no real need for it. And when I refused to back down, that's when my dad kicked me out. He told me to pack my things and get out of his house. That if I was going to act like an outsider, then I could go be one. My mom, of course, started crying, begging me not to destroy our family. She kept saying I was being spiteful, vindictive, cruel. Jake just smirked, like he had won, like he thought I was bluffing. I packed my bags that night. I wasn't about to beg them to let me stay. If anything, this just confirmed that I was doing the right thing. The only problem? I had nowhere to go. I spent the night in my car, my breath fogging up the windows as I stared up at the dark sky. My whole life, I had fought so hard to be self-sufficient, to prove I didn't need their approval. And now, here I was, thrown out like trash. But I wasn't broken, Because unlike Jake, I knew what it meant to survive. And the next morning, I found myself a lawyer. Hiring an attorney was expensive, but worth every penny. The moment I laid out my case, they told me I had a slam-dunk lawsuit. My parents had not only stolen from me, but they had done it through fraudulent misappropriation of a legal trust, which meant they were screwed. The first thing we did was freeze the house. Jake didn't even see it coming. One day, he was living comfortably, and the next, he was getting served with legal papers. And that's when my parents started begging. They called me nonstop. My mom left me crying voicemails, pleading for me to drop the case. My dad tried to act tough at first, but that facade cracked real quick when he realized this wasn't just going to go away. Suddenly, Jake wasn't so smug anymore. For weeks, they tried everything. First, they tried guilt. My mom sobbed about how families shouldn't fight over money. She said I was tearing us apart. Then they tried anger. My dad sent me long, furious texts, ranting about how I was an ungrateful, selfish little brat who was ruining Jake's future. Then, when neither of those worked, they tried to settle. They offered me a fraction of what they had taken. A pathetic, insulting amount. Just enough for them to still keep Jake's house while making it seem like they were making things right. I told them to go to hell. Because I wasn't just taking back my money. I was taking everything. As the court date loomed closer, my parents got desperate. They had spent years controlling me, and now they were finally losing control. My dad looked exhausted. My mom was barely holding it together, and Jake had no idea what to do. For once in his life, he wasn't being saved. He was going down with them. For the first time in their lives, my parents were trapped. All their lives, they had dictated the rules. They controlled everything. Who mattered, who didn't, who got what. And Jake, he had been at the center of it all, basking in their favoritism without a second thought. But now, they couldn't just talk their way out of this. I watched from a distance as they unraveled. My dad, the man who had always carried himself with that arrogant certainty, suddenly looked small. His broad shoulders slumped under the weight of reality. My mom, who spent years justifying every unfair decision, now looked tired, hollow-eyed, and nervous. Even Jake, who had never worried about a single thing in his life, was finally beginning to understand what it felt like to lose. Because he was about to lose everything. As soon as the case was filed, my parents shifted into full-blown panic mode. First, they ignored it. They told themselves and Jake that I was bluffing, that this was just some dramatic tantrum I'd throw before crawling back to them. Then, when it became clear that I wasn't backing down, they tried to bargain. They called me nonstop. My mom left voicemails, her voice cracking under the weight of her desperation, begging me to reconsider before I destroyed our family. My dad took a different approach. He didn't beg. He demanded. He sent long, furious texts, calling me an ungrateful little brat, saying that I was trying to ruin Jake's future out of spite. Spite? That was rich, coming from the man who stole my entire inheritance and handed it over to his favorite child. But I didn't respond, because at this point, there was nothing left to say. As news of a lawsuit spread, the cracks in their perfect family image started to show. People started asking questions. Extended family members, friends, old neighbors. They all wanted to know what the hell was going on. Of course, my parents lied. They told people that I was just being greedy, that I was selfish and trying to take something that belonged to the family. But not everyone bought it, because people started to remember things. They remembered how Jake had always been coddled and spoiled. They remembered how I had been pushed aside, ignored. Slowly, my parents' carefully constructed image of a happy, united family began to crumble. And they hated it. For weeks, Jake had been in denial. He had always been the golden boy, the untouchable one. He never had to fight for anything in his life. And now, for the first time ever, he was watching it all slip through his fingers. And he couldn't handle it. At first, he tried to act unbothered. He told people I was just being dramatic, that I was making a big deal out of nothing. Then, when he realized that wasn't working, he snapped. One night, he showed up at my rented apartment, banging on the door. The moment I opened it, he shoved his way inside, his face red with anger. He screamed at me, told me I was ruining his life, that I was a piece of shit for trying to take his house away. I just stood there, and that made him even angrier. Jake had always been used to getting his way, but now there was nothing he could do. He threw a punch. He had never hit me before, not really. He had always relied on words, manipulation, and our parents backing him up. But now, he was desperate. He was sloppy. I dodged. He stumbled forward, off balance. And when he looked up at me, I saw it in his eyes. Fear, not of me, but of losing. I took a deep breath and told him, calmly, firmly, without hesitation, that I didn't care how angry he was. That house was mine, and nothing he did was going to stop that. Jake stood there for a long time, his hands clenched into fists, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. And then he turned and walked out. But before he left, he muttered under his breath that I was dead to him. I didn't even flinch, because the truth, he had been dead to me for a long time. By the time we got to court, my parents looked wrecked. The weight of the lawsuit, the financial strain, the public humiliation, it had all taken a toll. For the first time in my life, I watched my dad sit in silence, his mouth pressed into a thin, exhausted line. My mom's eyes were red, her hands shaking. Jake wouldn't even look at me. I sat there across from them, watching as my lawyer laid out every detail of their fraud. The trust, the stolen funds, the illegal misappropriation. My parents tried to defend themselves, of course. They cried about family loyalty. They said they were just trying to help Jake. They even tried to argue that I was being cruel by taking legal action. But the judge didn't care about their emotional manipulation. The only thing that mattered was the law, and the law was on my side. When the ruling came down, it was devastating for them. Since my parents couldn't repay the stolen inheritance, the court ordered that Jake's house be seized. In a matter of minutes, he went from being a homeowner to being homeless. Jake lost it. He stood up, yelling at the judge, at me, at the entire world. He swore that this wasn't over, that he would never forgive me. My dad just sat there, defeated. My mom sobbed. I stood up, walked out, and didn't look back. Jake had to move back in with my parents. They were broke from legal fees, drowning in debt, and struggling to stay afloat. I moved into the house they tried to steal from me. I remodeled it, made it my own, and every now and then, I'd get texts from my mom. Messages that range from apologies to desperate attempts to reconcile. I never responded, because at the end of the day, they got exactly what they deserved. And for the first time in my life, I won.